How well are instructional tasks connected to curriculum standards in your school's curriculum plan? If you're having a hard time coming up with an answer to that question, then it might be time to think about alignment. So when we think about alignment in a school's curriculum plan, one way to look at it has to do with how well instructional tasks in that curriculum plan align with the stated curriculum standards, which we know are learning targets for all students that are normally met at the end of an academic year or grade level. So in the case of what we see on the screen, we have this standard. It's from the Next Gen Science Standards at the high school level related to energy. And it is to plan and conduct an investigation to provide evidence that the transfer of thermal and energy when two components of different temperature are combined within a closed system results in a more uniform energy distribution among the components of the system, which is essentially the second law of thermodynamics. And I wasn't a science teacher, but as educational leaders, we need to be able to unpack content standards in areas where we may not be content area experts. And with this one, it's no exception. It's written in lay terms and it's easy to unpack, which we'll do in a minute. But in any case, we know that we're dealing with that standard. And if we're looking at that standard in a unit plan as part of a school's school-wide curriculum plan, we might see this instructional task that students would test different cups of liquid, say foam versus metal versus glass, to see which keeps hot water warmer longer. And as instructional leaders, we need to ask ourselves the question, how well does that instructional task align with the standard? And how do we know? So let's get into it. In the field of education, we encounter a lot of concepts that are abstract. And I know that I always appreciate when I come across a resource that makes those abstract concepts a little more concrete with some scaffolding or strategies to help us understand what we're getting at. And to understand alignment between instructional tasks and curriculum standards, the explanation that's provided by Angela Lawler in her book, High Quality Curriculum, How to Design, Revise, or Adopt, I think is really helpful. It's the book that I use with the curriculum class that I teach at Creighton. And I want to share these classifications with you because I think they will help us to understand whether that instructional task is really aligned with that standard. So when we think about degrees of instructional task alignment with curriculum standards that might be articulated in a unit description of a school's school-wide curriculum plan, we might start with the concept of weak alignment. So the alignment of an instructional task to a standard would be considered weak if the task only loosely touches on the standard, or if the task involves the standard by chance, but it's not guaranteed or intentional. We can move on to moderate alignment, where the expectations are a little bit more rigorous in that the task addresses the standard, but the standard is not the main focus of the task. Another example of moderate alignment might be an instructional task that it's part of the standard, or the standard is part of the task, but not the centerpiece. So there might be components of the standard that are present within the task, but the task itself does not address all of the components of the standard. For it to be categorized as strong alignment, what we would want to see is an instructional task that clearly aligns to the standard. The task and the standard are almost one and the same, and the task addresses all parts and honors the intent of the standard. And Lawler makes a great comment in her text that when examining the curriculum, we are looking for tasks that are strongly aligned to the standards. Now, of course, not every single instructional task that a teacher plans is going to be strongly aligned with a standard. But analyzing the alignment in this way really allows us to gain clarity and a bigger picture about how standards are being addressed as a whole within the context of a school's curriculum plan. And determining alignment and how things are connected is really what curriculum improvement is all about. So to be able to do that, we need to start unpacking standards to come to some level of understanding as to what's involved with that specific standard. Now, some standards are simple, some standards are more complex, depending on the grade level and the subject area and what's being called for. In this example, I intentionally selected a complex standard, and let's take a look at what it's asking. So if we look at the statement of the standard, the first phrase that I notice is plan and conduct. And to me, what that means is that students will be involved in the development and the execution of the task. I also see words like an investigation, which to me means that the task is going to involve some form of scientific inquiry. I also see the phrase provide evidence. And for me, that means that the outcome of the task will result in some form of empirical data. And then there's the line transfer of thermal energy, and it goes on when two components of a different temperature, etc. Meaning that the inquiry will involve the understanding of the transfer of thermal energy in the context mentioned in the standard. And then finally, I see results in a more uniform energy distribution, noticing that not only the outcome, but the cause and effect relationship with what we previously identified. So there's a cause and effect component here. So essentially 5 different dimensions to this standard that with an instructional task that's highly aligned, we would expect to see that instructional task addressing all 5 of those components. So with those components in mind, we can take another look at this instructional task where students are testing different cups to see which keeps hot water warmer longer. And think about those 5 areas that we would expect to see in a highly aligned task or a strongly aligned task. And really, it's obvious that we're missing a lot. So I would call this weak alignment. The reason why I call it weak alignment is that the test is only tangentially related to the standards or the standard in that students are just testing temperature change. This doesn't really have anything to do with the second law of thermodynamics as it's explained in the standard. So let's look at some different examples that might be more closely aligned. So maybe we see a different instructional task that is connected to this standard. And that task is one where the teacher provides detailed procedures and the students follow the steps to mix hot and cold water to collect data and to analyze the results. So if we look at this, I think we're getting closer to an activity or a task that's more closely aligned. We can see that students are engaging in inquiry and collecting data, and the intent of the standard is more closely honored. But notice that the first word of the standard is for students to plan. And in this example, the students didn't really plan anything. They only conducted it by following the instructions that the teacher provided. So that would be a conversation maybe with the teacher about how the teacher could more carefully incorporate elements of student planning into that particular instructional task. And then finally, in this third example, we might see something where students develop an experiment that involves them selecting two solids of different initial temperatures, such as a warm rock or a cold metal block, placing them together in an insulated container, and then measuring temperature changes until equilibrium is reached. Then they graph the results to model the resulting uniform energy distribution. So in this context, with these tasks, we really see a complex, highly developed instructional task that is strongly aligned with the curriculum standard. The students are planning and conducting an investigation. They're generating data. They're providing evidence. It's involving thermal transfer. The cause and effect relationship is there. It's all there. So in this example, really the activity itself is the standard. So this would be a strongly aligned instructional task to this standard. Now, you might be thinking, wow, Dr. Fussell only ever shows examples from secondary schools. Well, don't worry. If you're an elementary school leader or aspiring leader, I have you covered. Here's an example from the Common Core third grade math standards. And it reads, to tell and write time to the nearest minute and measure time intervals in minutes. Solve word problems involving addition and subtraction of time intervals in minutes, for example, by representing the problem on a number line diagram. So let's say we're looking at that standard in a curriculum plan for third grade math, and then we see an instructional task like students solve equations like 1245 minus 1158 equals X number of minutes, or how many minutes. So what do we think of that? Well, we can break down this standard in a similar way as we used in the previous example with the science standard. And we can see that we're addressing the component about subtracting time intervals in minutes. So there's a piece there, but we're not doing the word problem component. We're not representing the problem on a number line diagram or plotting it out that way. So there's several components missing. And for that reason, I might say this is moderately aligned. It might even be weakly aligned. I have moderate alignment on the screen. But in any case, what I'm seeing is that that there are those components missing, and we could probably do more to fully meet the standard. Now, suppose you saw this example. For that standard, the instructional task is that students will color sections of a clock face, for example, shading 15 minutes past the hour. And for me, this task is really only tangentially connected to the standard. There's no expectation for students to write or tell time. There's no addition or subtraction component. This does not involve word problems. So this would definitely be on the weak end of the spectrum. And then finally, maybe we see an example like students solve word problems such as the class recess begins at 10:23 and ends at 10:47. How long is recess? And then they draw a number line diagram to represent the interval and figure it out and then explain their reasoning in their own words. So for me, this would be a strongly aligned task. Again, the task is essentially the standard. It involves all of the components, and we can see a student move from point A to point Z in this task, and we can see that it involves all of the components that are required in that math standard. So now that you're equipped with this way of looking at alignment between curriculum standards and instructional tasks, my hope for you is that you will have conversations with the teachers in your school about how they see alignment playing out in the instruction that they plan for their students in their classrooms. So with that, Godspeed and good luck to you, your school, and your teachers as you work together to continue to improve instruction for the benefit of all of your students. Thanks again.